Hello everyone, welcome to another new class of human physiology. We are almost end of our course. In this class we'll discuss about different type of sensory organs and also we'll see how they function. So let's stay with it. So what different concepts will be covered for this class? So in this week you remember we discussed about neuronal transmission. We also discussed about different type of glial cells, and now almost we are end of our course, end of our week also. So finally we will discuss in this class about different sensory organ, and we will see how the sensory organs like vision, hearing, smell, taste and touch eventually functions. So what is basically the sensory system? Sensory system integrates the specialized sensory receptors that detect stimuli from both the external and the internal environment. So from the external or internal environment, the sensory system eventually it detects different type of response, and it kind of transmit those sensory response towards the brain and the spinal cord. And once those the responses get processed inside our brain or through the motor neuron or the motor nerve, it generates different type of stimulation or the response. So what are different type of key functions for the sensory system? Basically the main key function is receiving the sensory input. So basically specialized receptors that detect stimuli like light, sound, chemicals, pressure and temperature. Then it also helps in terms of transmitting information to the brain. So as we said, once the sensory applications are received, this sensory system transmit those signals from spinal cord and to the brain, and finally processing and interpreting the sensory information. So once the sensory signals have been transmitted to the brain, they get processed in the different area of the brain, for example sensory cortex area, and eventually it interprets this signal, giving rise to different type of perceptions, okay, and eventually also consciousness and awareness of the related to this stimuli. This type of process basically involves lot of complicated neuronal pathways and integration with memory and other cognitive function. What are different type of senses? Basically we have mostly traditionally 5 type of sense, as we all know. It is vision, right? So in cases of vision, it helps in terms of detecting the light and allows us to basically perceiving the world visually. Also it helps in order to kind of understand the color, shape and movement. Then in case of hearing or the audition sense, it detects basically different type of sounds, enabling us to perceive auditory information like speech, music and other environmental sounds. Then olfaction in terms of smell, it detects airborne chemicals. It also allows us to kind of perceive odors. Then in terms of taste or gustation, it detects chemical in the mouth, allowing us to perceive different type of flavor. Finally in terms of touch, it detects pressure, temperature, pain, texture, etc. through different receptors of skin. Apart from that, other senses for example balance, body posture or body position and movement, and some sort of internal sensations can also be present using of this sensory organ or sensory system. The first one we will discuss about the vision, where eye is the most important component. So let's see different components of the eye. Through our eye we basically see the world. Along with that we can also understand the color, and we can also see the shape and overall structure of a object. So let's see what are different components of our eye. The first thing we will discuss, which is the cornea. You can see it is basically the transparent dome shaped outer layer of the eye, composed of several layers of specialized cells, and it lacks basically blood vessels. And what is cornea's function? It basically refracts or bends light. So you can see that from the cornea the lights get basically refracted or it gets bent when it enters the eye. In this way it plays a very crucial role in terms of focusing images on the retina. So from the cornea the lights get bent and eventually in the retina it focuses those image. Then sclera, you can see like this part which is the sclera. This is the white tough layer, mostly like a collagen and elastic fiber, and it is basically like a structural or protection. This is the function of the sclera. So this is a collagen layer, mostly like a to provide like a structural support. In the choroid, this is this part just inside of the sclera, you can see this is the vascular layer of the eye. It is located between the retina. So between the retina and the sclera, the vascular layer which is called as choroid is present, and the function is basically to provide oxygen and nutrients to the brain. Then the lens, you can see this part which is the one of the most crucial component of the eye, which is the lens. It is a flexible crystalline structure, right? This is a crystalline structure and flexible structure that is located behind the pupil. So just behind the pupil, you can see just behind the pupil the lens is located. And what is the function? Basically it fine tunes the focus by changing its shape through a process called accommodation. So in this way it allows us to see object clearly at a varying distance. So by changing the shape of the lens, it helps us in order to kind of see objects at varying distances. Then the iris, you can see the iris, basically it is a colored and circular part of the eye surrounding the pupil. And as you know, the function of iris is basically to regulate the diameter of the pupil, thereby controlling the amount of light it can enter. Then the pupil, which is basically a circular opening in the center of the iris, and the function is basically controlling how much amount of light it can enter through the eye. So pupil and the iris both has a role in terms of controlling the light movement and the light entry inside of our eye. Then the retina, it is one of the most important part, right? The retina, this yellow part which is the retina, you can see, right? So basically it is a light sensitive layer lining the inner surface of the back of the eye. And as you all know, like the function of retina is basically converting the light signal to the electrical signal that after that it gets transmitted to the brain. So in the retina, this is such an important area where light signal gets converted to the electrical signal, okay, and then it kind of gets transmitted to the brain. Then foeva, you can see this part, right? This part of foeva, basically it is a small central pit, and its function is basically it provides like a sharpest central vision. So it is just like a small pit, and it contains like higher concentration of the cone cells. In this way, these cone cells provide like a sharpest central vision. Then there is the ciliary muscle. You can see this muscles like ciliary muscles. It is a ring of smooth muscle in the eye's middle ear layer, and the function of this ciliary muscles, it is in terms of helping to control the accommodation, the process by which the lens changes its curvature. So basically with the help of the ciliary muscle, it controls the accommodation process. And then there are other components you can go through, for example like the aqueous humor. It is important in terms of maintaining the eye shape. Then the vitreous humor, in terms of it helps in terms of maintaining the eye's spherical shape and supports also the retina. And then another most important components are the optic nerve. So you can see there are the optic nerve which are present. See the bunch of optic nerves that comes out of the eye. And why these are important? Because as we told that in the retina it kind of changes the light signal to the electrical signal, and these electrical signal basically transmits via the optic nerve to the brain. So via the optic nerve the electrical signal eventually transmit to the brain for further processing. Then very importantly in our eyes there are two type of receptor, one is rod receptor, second is the cone receptor. These are basically photoreceptor. So in terms of rod, these are highly like sensitive photoreceptor that are mostly present in the retina, and it enables basically the vision in the low light condition. So this rod type of photoreceptor improves the night vision of a person. And more like the cones, the concentrated in the periphery of the retina, thus it is responsible for black and white vision. Okay, and cones, you can see these are another type of photoreceptor. These are less sensitive, not as sensitive like the rods, and mostly it enables the color vision. Okay, so in cases of the rods, it can kind of help or responsible for like the black and white vision, along with like containing the low light condition or the night vision, but in terms of the cones, it enables the color vision. Okay, apart from that, like less numerous than rod, concentrated mostly in the fovea area, and it require like a brighter light to function. So in case of cones, it requires brighter light to function. In case of rod, it can even work in the darker condition or the night vision also. And you see, let's see like the human visual pathway. So basically initially like light enters in the eye and is focused in the cornea and lays onto the retina. So you can see how light enters and eventually it is focused on the cornea and the lens, and then the light gets inverted, right, onto the retina. And in the retina, what we said, it gets converted to the from light to the electrical signal, right, and now these electrical signals are eventually transmitted, right. So basically like who eventually kind of converts this light to electrical signals. So these photoreceptors which are present, mostly the rods and the cones. So these rods and cones eventually convert the light to the electrical signal, and then through the optic nerve these signals basically kind of goes to our brain. But an interesting thing happens here in this optical like chiasm area. You can see in this crossover, basically this is a crossover where the right eye or the signals which are received from the right eye, eventually it goes and transmit to the left part of the brain, and the signals which is received in the left eye, it gets crossover and it goes to the right side of the brain. So this kind of crossover happens, and eventually in the brain cortex there is the occipital lobe, right. So in the visual cortex, the presence of occipital lobe we already discussed. This occipital lobe of the brain basically processes these electrical signal, and they try to kind of eventually understand or kind of process the brain to understand the size, shape, color of the object or even distance. Then the ear, which is the important organ for hearing. So basically, as we all know, like ear contributes in terms of like hearing, right, or the eventually like listening to different type of music or sound or environmental noises. So ear has like different component. You can see like it can be like external component, middle part, and the inner ear. So in the outer ear, it has like this funnel type of shape, right, which is called as the external auditory canal, right. So you have this two component, one is this canal area or the which is also called the external auditory canal, and then you also have this funnel kind of shape which is the pinna or auricle. So basically from here only we first perceive the voice or different type of sounds, and once we perceive the sounds, this goes via this external auditory canal or the ear canal. Then in the middle layer you can see there are like different kind of composition. Mostly we will see like tymanic membrane or the eardrum is present, right. So this tymanic membrane or the eardrum is present here. This is a thin cone shaped membrane that vibrates in response to the sound wave. Now we will see like different type of bones, like three tiny bones are generally present, which are as a combination are called that ossicles, which are malleus, incus and stapes. right? It helps in terms of transmitting the vibration for the from the eardrum to the inner ear. Okay, so what it does basically, whenever this initial sound response comes, it vibrates and eventually it transmits the vibration from the middle layer to the inner layer. And in the inner ear, what we can see is like it is also made of like different composition, where the spiral shape fluid field like structure is observed that basically converts the sound vibration into the electrical signal. It also contains like hair type of cells that has like sensory receptors within the cochlea, okay, that basically transduce mechanical vibration to electrical signal. So initially when those three small tiny bones were vibrated, it sends some mechanical vibration signal, and eventually in the inner ear part it converted to the electrical signal inside of the hair cells. And finally the vestibular system, which is like a series of interconnected chamber and the canals responsible for the balance and spatial orientation. And you can see like in the vestibular system we can observe like circular canal, which is like three fluid filled canals that detect rotational movement of the head. We can also see like arteriole and saccule, which are basically to detect linear acceleration and head position relative to the gravity. Then the next one, which is olfactic kind of organ, which is a nose, which is also important for taking or perceiving different type of smell. It is made with like different component, for example the external nose, nasal cavity, nostrils, nasal conchae, then olfactory epithelium, olfactory receptor cells and mucous membrane. And what are basically like the olfactory pathway? So basically initially like the odor molecules or the chemical molecules in the air, it gets dissolved in the mucous lining of the olfactory epithelium. So basically these are the olfactory epithelium cells. So different type of chemical molecules which are present in the air, it gets dissolved in this olfactory epithelium. Okay, and the olfactory receptor cells in epithelium detect the odor molecules and generate electrical signals. So once it kind of dissolves here in the olfactory epithelium cells, it creates like electrical signals, and via this olfactory nerve these electrical signals basically gets transmitted to the brain area of olfactory bulb. So where in the olfactory bulb these electrical signals which gets transmitted, these signals get processed, and eventually based on kind of the responses, these signals transmitted to different part of the brain areas, including like the olfactory cortex, which is mostly responsible for the perception of different type of odor. Okay. Then finally like the fourth major sense is the sense of taste, and the responsible organ for that is the tongue. So tongue is like a muscular organ which is present inside of our mouth that aids in terms of like speech, right, that aids like in terms of speech, chewing, swallowing, etc. Okay. So in terms of like tongue, what it has, it can see like it has lot of taste bud. Basically these are the sensory structure that contains the taste receptor cells. So basically taste bud contains the taste receptor cells, and the taste receptor cells are the specialized cells which are present in the taste bud that can detect different type of taste molecule, and different type of taste it can sense, and the location of the tongue basically controls, or it basically directs which type of taste can be detected in which area of the tongue. So basically in cases of sweet taste, different type of sweet taste can be sensed in the tip of the tongue. So in the tip of the tongue, sweet taste can be perceived. Okay. In cases of the sour taste, it basically detects on the side. So all type of sour taste is basically can be perceived on the sides. Then the salty taste basically it can be detected in the front edges. So all these front edges can be detected the salty taste, right. So salty taste can be detected in the front edges. Then the bitter taste can be mostly detected in the back side. So basically in the back side bitter taste can be detected, and then in terms of the umami, it detected across the middle of the tongue. Basically the savory taste primarily detected by the receptors that responds to the glutamate and other amino acid. Okay. So the basically the taste molecules in the food that initially get dissolved in the saliva, and after that it interacts with the taste receptor cells, which basically generate the electrical signals, and these electrical signals, as you all know, like we discussed, that it will get transmitted to the different sensory nerves, for example the facial, glossopharyngeal and vagus nerves of the brain stem, and then those signals will be relayed to the thalamus, right. Finally those signals will reach to the gustatory cortex of the brain, where they will be processed in terms of perception of the taste. Lastly, the touch signal is be processed via the skin, which is one of the largest organ of our body. It has different layer, for example the epidermis, which is the outermost layer of the cells, where Merkel type of cells are present. Then the middle layer, which is called the dermis cell, it is just beneath the epidermis, and it contains like different type of collagen, blood vessels, sweat glands. Also it has different type of nerve ending. And the lastly the hypodermis, which is the deepest layer or the inner layer of the skin, which located beneath the dermis, and the components are present along with the adipose tissue, blood vessels and the nerve. And basically there are a lot of mechanoreceptors are present, right. You can see all these mechanoreceptors. Apart from that, thermoreceptors also present. This helps in terms of understanding like the cold or warm condition. Apart from that, lot of nociceptor or the pain receptors are also present in the skin. This helps us to understand in cases of like if we sense any type of pain or not, and immediately if we sense any pain, warm, cold condition, these will get processed, and initially through the sensory nerve the signals will be transmitted to our brain, and after the perception and the process will kind of show like reflex action. So do you know the human nose can detect trillion of different odors. The skin is the largest sensory organ, right, and stapes is the smallest bone present in the middle ear. So activity question: right side of the brain is controlled by which part of the brain? So can you say like right side of our vision is controlled by which part of the brain? So we already discussed, right, the crossover thing. So if you have any further question, please discuss with us during the live session. You can also send us your question in the email. So we are almost the end of our physiology class. Today we discussed thoroughly about different type of sensory organs, and also we saw like what are different type of cells that process sensory organ and kind of generate different type of perception or like different type of responses. So thank you again for attending today's class of human physiology. We will meet with you very soon with another new class. Basically we are leaving with one more class where we will discuss about neurological disorder. So let's meet with you very soon with the last class, which would be neurological disorder, and then we will end our human physiology course. Thank you again for staying with us.